Yeah, they use violent means, but as I'm sure you know, if you look at the State Department human rights reports or Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, though they are violent, they're responsible for a small part of the violence. Most of it is the government or its paramilitary forces. Uh, a couple of years ago, it was the government that was responsible for most of the violence. That didn't play very well. So they did what most sensible governments do. They farm out the terror to paramilitaries, like Serbia and Kosovo. You know, it wasn't government violence, paramilitary violence, Bosnia and so on, or Indonesia and East Timor. That sensible governments farm out terror and atrocities, just as sensible imperial states try to get the colonial power, the colonized powers to carry out the violence. So what's happened is that the level of violence attributable to the government and paramilitaries has stayed about the same, like 80%. But the component of that that's attributable directly to the government has declined and the paramilitaries has gone up. On the other hand, nobody who investigates doubts that there are very close links between them. In fact, Human Rights Watch, in particular, has published report after report, very recent ones, detailing specific links. So yes, the guerrillas are violent, and it's a small part of the violence. Most of the violence, overwhelmingly, is government and paramilitaries. And those are the people we're supporting. Okay, so they're all involved in drugs up to their necks. But that's not where Plan Colombia is directed. In fact, the paramilitaries themselves say that 70% of their income comes from drugs. Castaño said that right over television in Colombia. But they're not targeted, just as, in fact, our arms flow and military support goes to them indirectly through the government. So whatever's going on, it's not a war against violence, okay, because we're supporting the largest component of the violence, even by State Department analyses. Furthermore, it's not a war against drugs, I don't think. If it was a war against drugs, we wouldn't fight it this way. This so-called war against drugs has been going on for years and years, and it's having no effect on drug use. Okay, if people are and these people aren't imbeciles, if you carry out a policy year after year the same way, and you see it has no effect on what you claim, what you're trying to do, and you keep carrying out again, something else is happening. Okay, and it's pretty obvious what's happening. In Colombia and the other Andean countries, it's counterinsurgency war. It's war against domestic opposition groups. We can look into the history of those, and you look into their history, it's like most. People turn to guerrillas and become violent when all other options are closed. Okay, then you get violence. The same is true around the world, Kashmir, Central America, everywhere. Algeria. You close off political options, you can be pretty sure that you're going to end up with violence. And that, if you look over the history of Colombia, it's what's happened. Highly unequal. It's a potentially rich society, extreme inequality, huge poverty, tiny percentage of the population has all the land and all the wealth. And people are driven off into marginal areas to survive. They can't. In fact, part of the reason for growing drugs, and this has been known for years, is that the West simply undermined and destroyed their commodity production. Like 30 years ago, the UNCTAD tried to organize a commodity, an agreement of commodity exporters to stabilize export prices, like it's done routinely in rich countries. And that's crucial for, say, small coffee growers. If coffee prices are going to go wildly oscillating, it doesn't harm agribusiness. They can handle it. But a small farmer can't survive. You can't tell your children, don't bother eating next year. Maybe 2 years from now, there'll be some food. Okay? So they were simply driven by Western policies, basically neoliberal policies. They were driven into something that they could grow to survive. Same in Bolivia and elsewhere. And furthermore, they're taught, go to school in Harvard or wherever, you're taught that you're supposed to be a rational wealth maximizer, right? And I take any economics courses, that's what you're supposed to be. The peasants are told the same thing. You're supposed to be rational wealth maximizers, rational peasants it's called. That means you produce, it's the whole literature on this. I'm sure you know it better than I do if you're in development studies. You got to be a rational peasant. A rational peasant is a peasant who tries to maximize profit, and of course for export, because you don't want to produce for the local market, since that has to be saturated by highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness. So therefore that's out. So you can't produce for the local market. You've got to be a rational peasant trying to maximize profit for export. What does that spell? You know? Yeah, it spells opium, coca, and so on. When they learn their lessons and they become rational peasants, they're rewarded, namely by helicopter gunships, fumigation, you know, death squads, and so on. That's called development, I think it's called, or something like that. And yeah, so that's what they do. You think the planners don't know this? I mean, you know, of course they know it. But in these countries, they're not fighting a war on drugs. They're fighting a war of control. You know, it's another pretext for the traditional counterinsurgency type wars. What about inside the United States? Are they fighting a war on drugs here? Of course not. And they know it perfectly well. I mean, study after study has shown that if you want to deal with substance abuse, the most cost-effective way by a huge margin is prevention and treatment. Education, prevention, and treatment. You know, that has big effects on substance abuse. The least effective way, you know, by an orders of magnitude practically, is out-of-country destruction. In fact, interdiction and policing are much less cost-effective than prevention and treatment. But the expenses, and this isn't really controversial, you know, like you read in Rand Corporation reports and so on, but the expenses go the other way. So any reasonable person will conclude whatever's going on here, it's not a war on drugs. So what is it here? Well, my suspicion is that here, too, it's kind of the rich man's counterpart to counterinsurgency. It's these so-called neoliberal program. What's going on here for the last 20 or 25 years is a kind of a version of structural adjustment adapted to a rich country. So it means a substantial part of the population is kind of useless for wealth production. If it's in Colombia, you send death squads out to kill them. We're more civilized. You stick them in jail. Okay? So the incarceration rate has shot up, very closely correlated with drug abuse. A lot of it victimless crimes. You know, find a kid in Roxbury with a joint or something. So the useless part of the population, the surplus population, is you get rid of somehow, like send them to jail. And the rest of the population, you frighten. Now, that's a good way of controlling people whose incomes, whose wages have stagnated or declined for about 20 years, who are working far harder than ever before in order to keep stagnant incomes, and who are left out of this very narrow concentration of wealth. Actually, the last 20 years, including the last 10 years, have not been a high growth period. They've been a relatively low growth period in per capita growth. But there has been some growth, and it's highly concentrated. It's for people like us. Most of the population is left out, and they don't like it, and you've got to control them somehow. And the best way of controlling people is fear. You know, traditional way of controlling people is frighten them of something. Drugs is something you can be frightened about. So you got a kind of a dual system of control, and on those assumptions, the war against drugs makes perfect sense. I mean, it's not declaring meeting the announced objectives. In fact, it's failing them hopelessly. But it is achieving these objectives. So it's only rational to assume that those are the objectives. Actually, I should say there's another question you ought to be asking yourself. Suppose that it was a war on drugs. You know, suppose that's why we're fumigating peasant farmers in Colombia. Does that legitimate it? I mean, does Colombia have the right to come here and carry out chemical warfare in Kentucky and North Carolina? And why not, after all? Like, more Colombians die of tobacco-related diseases than the number of people who die here of coca-related diseases. If you consider China, you know, huge numbers, tens of millions of people are dying from tobacco-related diseases. Tobacco is far more lethal than hard drugs. We not only produce it, we export it, and we threaten other countries with trade sanctions unless they accept not only accept our lethal substances, but accept advertising for them, and in fact advertising directed to vulnerable populations like women and children. The Colombia cartel is not allowed to put up television ads, with some counterpart to Joe Camel saying how much fun it is to us. They can't do that. But free speech would be violated, our noble principles, if tobacco companies weren't allowed to do that in, say, South Korea. Okay, so we're exporting our lethal substances and forcing people to take them, but does that give them the right to carry out helicopter gunship bombing and counterinsurgency operations in Kentucky and North Carolina? None of us think so. So therefore, again, if we're not hypocrites, we think that we don't have the right to do that in Colombia or Bolivia, even if it was destroying drugs. So on the best assumptions you can imagine, it's totally criminal from every possible point of view.